Hello and welcome to this video. Today we have Dr. Graham Oppy onto the channel to talk about infinity. Dr. Graham Oppy is a leading scholar in the philosophy of religion and has written a book on infinity. So if you want to learn more about what we're discussing in this channel, then make sure you go check that out. I'll link that in the description below. But to start off, Dr. Oppy, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for asking me on.
Thank you for coming onto the channel. I'm really looking forward to this discussion because the last interview that we've uploaded on this channel with the professor was with Dr. Andrew Loke, who's done a lot of research on the Kalam cosmological argument. And of course, those who are familiar with the philosophy of religion understand that infinities do play a very large role in that argument. And while we're not really discussing only the philosophy of religion side of infinities in this video, hopefully by understanding or watching this interview, you'll get perhaps a larger context of debates and discussions on the infinity. So perhaps to start off with, Dr. Oppy, what drew you into researching about the infinity in philosophy and mathematics?
So I guess maybe it's not right to say that I'm a kind of researcher into infinity in mathematics. That would be going a bit far. But I did an undergraduate major in maths, and in first year, there were two subjects that I took that both featured infinity. So one of them was a subject called algebra and geometry. And in it, we learned about bijection and cardinality, that is Cantor's theory of cardinals. And the other subject was real analysis. And in that, there was a lot of stuff about bounds and limits, and that in a different way, in continuity, that in a different way involves talk about infinity. So yeah, that was how it started. It was because I studied some of the relevant mathematics.
So I suppose developing on that, you touched upon Cantor and boundaries. How would you say the concept of infinity has developed throughout mathematics and in philosophy? It starts off perhaps with Cantor, or does it go even further than that? What are our conceptions of infinity?
Okay, so this is hard to do quickly. So
yes.
Aristotle had a concept of the infinite, but he thought that there could only be a kind of potential infinites like the future, which doesn't, according to Aristotle, I guess, didn't exist all in a realized form. It's just that for each day there could be another one. So he didn't, and I think he denied that there could be an actual infinity. For example, he denied that there could be infinitely many stars. And given his conception of the universe, there certainly wouldn't have been room to fit infinitely many stars in there. So maybe because of his cosmology and other things, it was kind of plausible that there wasn't anything that was actually infinite, at least infinitely large. There's this other question about the infinitely small, whether space is infinitely divisible or not. And his view was that the divisions were potential, right? So space didn't actually come in points, but you could kind of divide a space into smaller spaces. And that view about infinity persisted for a very long time, and some people still endorse it. But a long time ago, at least by the time of Galileo, people had recognized that you could take what looked like an infinite set, say the natural numbers, and put it into one-to-one correspondence with some of its subsets, for example, the even numbers. Right. And that gives rise to a different way of thinking about infinity. So not as merely sort of potential necessarily, but the idea that there might, maybe there are structures in the world that have this property, that there's a correspondence between whole and some proper part, as there is with the natural numbers and the even numbers. Right. So I think that would be the most kind of significant addition to Aristotle. People have argued then about whether there are actual infinities, and people have argued about whether we should employ the notion of actual infinity even in mathematics. So there are intuitionists, people like Brouwer and Heiting, who thought that there's no way that we should be thinking that there are actual infinities in mathematics. The standard view, the view that won out, the view that I was just taught as a matter of course in my first year maths lectures was, of course, there are in the mathematical realm, there are infinite collections. The natural numbers are one. For any natural number, add one to it, you get another one. So there's no, if you want a number, you want to say how many natural numbers there are. If you pick any natural number to do the numbering, you're too small because you could add one and get it to be bigger. So it must be that it's an actual infinity, and its cardinality is what Cantor called LF null, what he thought was the smallest of the cardinalities.
That's a very interesting introduction to a lot of the literature, or I suppose the development of infinity throughout history. Perhaps to kind of break that down a bit, can you start off with perhaps telling us the difference between potential and actual infinities, perhaps for someone who may have never come across this distinction between the two?
So so that's kind of tricky, right? Because I think people really struggle to give a decent account of what the potentially infinite is. It's very easy to give an account of the actual infinite if we're thinking about, for example, whether there's infinitely many stars. What we mean is, could we, assigning natural numbers to the stars, exhaust the natural numbers in, assigning the numbers out? That would be an actual infinity of stars. Potential infinite typically is explained sort of in the way I did, in terms of the future, right? At any point in the future, there will only be finitely many days that have elapsed, but potentially they say there's infinitely many future days. For each future day, there might be another one. Now, what I'd want to say in that case is that just means there's an actual infinity. It's just that it's never going to be true that actual infinity, there'll be no particular day where we can say we've had infinitely many days now, right? And so it's not clear that the future really provides you an example of something where the infinity is merely potential. Either there's going to be a last day or there isn't. If there is, then the future's finite. If there isn't, then the future's actually infinite, because the only sensible number you can assign to the cardinality of the days is LF null. So I'm not going to try to fix up the notion of potential infinity. I'm not sure that it can be really fully explained.
So you touched also upon the idea of Aleph null and Cantor. I suppose in the past, when I was doing a bit of reading on the infinity, I came across some developments in axiomatic set theory and more discussions surrounding how, I guess, the idea of Aleph null there's also Aleph 1 and Aleph 2 and so on. And so forth, but I've never really grasped, I suppose, fully this concept of there being different orders of infinity, if that's the right way to put it. And sometimes some people might also have that confusion. So can you please explain perhaps the development of these different Aleph numbers and kind of how one can come to terms with them?
Okay, so this is just straight Cantor. Cantor said, okay, how many natural numbers are there? It's not a finite number. It's got to be, if we're saying how many of them there are, we're going to need a new symbol to designate it. We'll call it LF naught. Anything that can be put into one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers will have that same cardinality. Now think about the even numbers and the natural numbers. We can match them up: 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 3 to 6, 4 to 8. So we know that there's got to be at least as many natural numbers as there are even numbers, but that mapping showed that there's got to be at least as many even numbers as there are natural numbers. So there's the same number. They're both LF naught. What about the rational numbers? Well, Cantor showed that you can put them into one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. So the cardinality of the rational numbers, that is anything that you can express as a ratio of two natural numbers, is itself Aleph naught, right? That's the cardinality of the rationals. And so then there's this question that comes up about, is there any collection that's bigger, anything that you can't put into one-to-one correspondence with the natural numbers. And Cantor again proved that the real numbers that you can, if you think about their decimal representation, and we'll just focus on the ones that are 0 point something, you can have, they just go on and on forever, right?
Yeah.
Like the decimal representation of pi doesn't terminate. Now, how did Cantor prove that there are more rational numbers than real numbers? Well, if there are only finitely many, we can make a list of all of them in principle, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, and then we can write them next to, right? I mean, in practice, we can't do this, but we can imagine it. Okay, so imagine that you've done this. So you've got this complete list of all the real numbers, and you've assigned a natural number to each of them. Now let's make a new number. We'll look at the first decimal place in the first number, and we'll pick a different number, but not 9. So if it's 7, we might pick 4. So we have 0.4. Then let's go to the second number and do the same thing. So suppose that it's a 9, we write, say, 0. We do that for all of the numbers on the list. We've now made a new number, a new real number that isn't on the list. And that contradicts our assumption that we'd constructed a complete list of all of the real numbers. So there have to be more real numbers than there are natural numbers, right? And so Cantor called the cardinality of the real numbers C, and there's a conjecture about whether it's LF2, whether it's the next biggest cardinal after LF1. And I think you can construct mathematics in a way that makes that turn out to be true, and in a way that makes it turn out to be false. But I'm not going to put my life on that at the moment, right? But in any case, once we've got, so there's another way of constructing, given a set of any cardinality, a bigger set, and that is to, so you've got this set of a certain size. If you take all the subsets of members of that set, that's going to be, the set of all those subsets is going to have a bigger cardinality than the set that you started with. So you know that there's an infinite hierarchy here. After LF1, there is LF2, which may or may not be C, LF3, and so on. It just keeps on going. And for any cardinality, there's a bigger one just by this taking subsets operation.
Yes. Perhaps taking a step back, and for people who may have come to this discussion, I suppose, without any prior understanding of mathematics, what would be the difference between cardinals and ordinals? I suppose these might be terms that people might not be too familiar with.
Right. So cardinals is just an answer to the question, how many? So if you've got a fruit bowl with some fruit in it, you can count the fruit, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever, and you're just using the cardinals. The ordinals are ordered. So 2 comes after 1, 3 comes after 2, 4 comes after 3, 5. So am I saying them the right way around? 5 comes after 4, and so on, right? And so it's to do with ordering, right? So that's hence ordinal as opposed to cardinal. And when we go sort of to infinity, we, with the cardinals, with the how many question, above all of the natural numbers, if Cantor's right, the first thing you come to is LF0, right, the how many natural numbers are there in total. With ordinals, the first ordinal after all of the natural numbers is called omega, right? And then you can have omega plus 1, omega plus 2, omega plus 3, and so on, because it's what's called the limit ordinal. It's the next ordinal after the ones that, after all the numbers that we had already. So omega is the limit ordinal for the natural numbers. And then when you get to sort of, you've got omega plus, and you get the next limit ordinal after that, I think will be 2 omega plus, and you keep going. So there's an awful lot of these before you end up with a collection that's bigger than the collection of the natural numbers, right? It's a truly the amount of ordinals that fit in there before you expand the set so that it's as big as the real numbers is really astronomical. I don't think I'll try and explain that, because I think I've said enough now to give you a sense of what's the difference between the cardinals and the ordinals.
That definitely does clarify things quite a lot. Now, I suppose another question that someone might have, or when they're reading about the infinity, would be they might come across two terms, and I suppose this is developing on what we're currently discussing, is the difference between naive set theory and axiomatic set theory. And you have naive set theory, to my understanding, kind of to be referred to Cantor's kind of set theory. It was more of a naive conception. And then after that, you have, at least to my understanding, people like Zermelo Fraenkel who come up with an axiomatic set theory in relationship to Cantor's set theory, to develop upon it. And I was wondering perhaps what it leads to this development, and how can one differentiate between the two and conceive of the differences between the two of them?
So possibly what you just said is unfair to Cantor. So it's not clear. It's true that Cantor didn't give an axiomatic development of his set theory, but it's not clear that his set theory was naive, right? The person who you should be talking about here is Frege. So Frege gave an axiomatization of what he took to be maybe he didn't call them sets, but collections of things. But his axiomatization was inconsistent, right? Russell. So basically, Frege assumed if you had something that you could use to characterize a characterization, there was a set that was defined by the characterization. And Russell said, well, what about the set of all sets that are not members of themselves? Is it a member of itself or not? Either way, right, you end up in contradiction. So that naive characterization postulate, any condition determines a set, turns out to be unacceptable. And in the later developments of axiomatic set theory, like you referred to the kind of Zermelo Fraenkel, perhaps with the axiom of choice, is the kind of standard set theory now. There's no characterization postulate in it, right? It rather tells you, it sort of gives you a way of constructing all the sets, right? Starting from, if you like, just starting from the null set, you can kind of build pure set theory entirely from that. And you never use these postulates like the characterization postulate that Frege had in the construction of the sets. So what was going on there was that if you tried to build set theory around a characterization postulate, you got into paradoxes, you got into contradiction. And ZFC is just a way of building set theory without doing that. As I said, it's not clear that Cantor was committed to any kind of characterization postulate. It's not, and it seems that he was probably aware that there were consistency issues with going that way, though I'm not 100% sure about that. But at any rate, there's a kind of literature, which I'm not fully across, about Cantor, which at least some of which suggests that maybe his set theory wasn't naive in the way that Frege's was.
So you do raise, I suppose, Bertrand Russell and paradoxes. When we come to the discussion of the concept of infinity, and a lot of people watching this channel would be quite interested in the philosophy of religion and probably have come across a lot of debates surrounding infinity and the cosmological arguments. So in these debates surrounding infinity, what is the role of paradoxes, and are there perhaps different types of paradoxes which target different aspects of infinity and set theory? For I suppose as an example would be, I suppose, Russell's paradox in comparison to like Hilbert's hotel. They seem to be getting at perhaps a slightly different aspect of infinite set theory, even though they both seem to be paradoxes against infinite in a broader kind of categorization.
So there are some questions which are kind of theoretical questions about infinity in mathematics, right? So people like Brouwer worried that just talking about actual infinities in mathematics was incoherent or led to paradoxes or something like that. And so that's one sort of issue. Most people in mathematics, my lecturers were entirely typical and not worried about that at all. They think that ZFC and Cantor's theory of the cardinals and all that stuff is just absolutely fine. There's a different question about what could be realized in the world. So, for example, you mentioned Hilbert's Hotel. Could there be, in a world like ours, a hotel with infinitely many rooms? Right. Now, there are people, so William Lane Craig is a good example, who have argued that there are just intolerable consequences from assuming that there could be a hotel with infinitely many rooms, because things like the following could happen. The hotel could be full and someone could turn up. And you can say, no worries, we can accommodate you. And then you just move each person one room up. So the person in room N goes to N plus 1, the person in room 1 goes to room 2, and the new person fits into room 1. Right. And he thought, well, that can't really happen. Right. That's kind of absurd. So while you can have in mathematics these 1-1 correspondences between the natural numbers and the even numbers or something like that, you couldn't instantiate it in reality. And there's worse. Infinitely many people could turn up. You move all the people into a room that's double the number that they're in, and then that frees up half the rooms and well, whatever. No, that's not what I want to say. I want to make it work out so we move the person in room 1 to room 2, the one in room 2 to room 4, the one in room 3 to room 6, so that we're opening up 1, 3, and 5. Yeah, so you can do it, right? You just make it, you move everybody to the even numbered rooms, and whatever. There's some way of accommodating infinitely many people, and that seems even worse. So that's a different kind of problem from the kind of theoretical problems that are alleged by intuitionists and finitists and maybe some other kind of renegade mathematicians.
So you do raise, I suppose, intuitionists, and someone who might come to this video might be kind of confused about what are these different types of mathematical, I suppose, positions, like intuitionists, and then they hear about someone who's adhering to more of a set theory kind of approach or axiomatic approach to mathematics. What would you say are the major differences between these two camps, and what categorizes someone as an intuitionist per se?
So the kind of standard thing that you get taught in Philosophy 101 is that while the classical mathematicians accept the law of excluded middle, right, for any proposition, either P or not P, the intuitionists reject that. They think that there are cases where you have neither P nor not P, and this is related to their views about infinity, but this is kind of how it manifests. And so what this means is that there are a bunch of things that classical mathematicians will say as a proof, but they rely on excluded middle, and so intuitionists will not accept them as proofs. And this is related in a kind of interesting way to their views about infinity. I mean, I think that's kind of enough.
Definitely. So developing upon, I suppose, we've heard a bit about some of the paradoxes surrounding the infinite in relationship to its objection to whether infinite sets can be realized in reality. What are perhaps some other arguments that people have raised against this perhaps a real application of the infinity in reality? Is there any, I suppose, further objections towards that? Or
So apart from Hilbert's Hotel, because
Mhm.
there are lots and lots of these paradoxes.
Mm.
So another one that's quite well known and gets a lot of currency at the moment is a paradox due to Jose Benedetti called the Grim Reaper paradox. I may regret trying to explain this one, but I'll give it a shot. So we're to imagine that we've got a whole bunch of assassins, would-be assassins, infinitely many of them. And we've lined them up and they're all primed. So there's a particular target, Joe, and the assassins are all in place. And so one of them, so the assassination is going to take place somewhere between 12 and 1. So we've got one of the Reapers at 12:30. And if Joe's still alive at that point, that assassin is going to kill him. And then halfway between 12:30 and 12 o'clock, so at 12:15, so halfway in between, there's another assassin who's going to kill Joe if he survived that long. And then we keep dividing the interval in half and putting another assassin in, all the way back to there's no assassin at 12 o'clock, but there are infinitely many of them at 12:30, 12:15, 12, 7.5, and so on. Right. Now, what happens to Joe? Well, there's no particular Reaper, no particular assassin who can kill him, because if he's still alive at a particular point, there's a whole lot of assassins, infinitely many, in fact, who would have killed him already by that point. So for every assassin, there's an earlier assassin. So that assassin doesn't kill him. And yet it's certain that Joe dies. So how does he die, given that there's no assassin that kills him? It's impossible for any of the assassins to kill him because he's got to be just under the construction, given the instructions that they've been given. For any one of them, they're too late. Some earlier one will have done it.
Mm.
So the thought is this is incoherent, right? It can't be that someone ends up dead with an assassin's bullet, but there's no bullet that in particular that kills them. And so the thought that time's infinitely divisible in this way, in a way that means that we could set up the assassins in this way, is incoherent, right? So that's an objection to the kind of divisibility type of infinity rather than Hilbert's Hotel, which is to the kind of cardinality objection. But that's another puzzle of a different kind that most people find quite challenging to think about.
Would you say that when in discussions, I suppose, in modern literature about the possibility of an actual infinity in reality, we hear a lot about discussions about paradoxes, and people are debating about whether these paradoxes are strong, I suppose, an objection to this conception of infinity in the real world. But are there any other, I suppose, directions which philosophers have taken apart from paradoxes to approach the concept of infinity? Are there any other of these debates or kind of frameworks that people are having?
Well, there are definitely applications. So one of the consequences that you might draw from something like Benedetti's paradox is that the past has to be finite, right? And we can tell a different versions of the story in which you get what look like paradoxical results if you allow the past to be infinite. And you mentioned the Kalam cosmological argument before. We get people like William Lane Craig arguing against the infinity of the past on a priori grounds, that it would open the gates to various kinds of impossibilities. Right now, obviously, it doesn't directly impact Hilbert's Hotel if we're thinking about it as a hotel that's existing all at once in the present. But there'll be other kinds of alleged paradoxes that some people, Andrew Lake's a good example, want to argue things that are impossible would be possible if it were possible for the past to be infinite.
Mhm.
Okay, so that's now we're kind of squarely in philosophy of religion, philosophy more broadly, and we've kind of moved away from the worries about the mathematics and set theory.
Definitely. I suppose the next question, which you do raise, I guess, in relationship to the Kalam or William Lane Craig's presentation of it, is the distinction or the implications that one's theory of time may have on infinity. You talk about, I suppose, the past as in some sense of an A theory, I suppose, as some people might call it, this dynamic view of time where we're going into the future. Is this kind of can we successively, by addition, go into the future or into the past infinitely, or if someone just took like a static view of time, just to say, well, all right, all of this exists at once. How big do you think the implication of either an A theory or B theory of time would have on one's conception of whether it's possible for the infinity to be, I suppose, an actual infinity to be real in the real world?
So I guess my hunch is that it makes no difference. But there's a particular thought that might make it seem as though it does. This has to do with exactly what you mean by something's being actually infinite as opposed to merely potentially infinite. So if you think about the future, I said before that although the future is actually infinite in the sense that the number of days is unbounded, for every day there's another, let's suppose, there will never be a day at which the number of days is LF naught. Every day gets a natural number, right? But every day eventually comes. And so if you ask how many days eventually come, the answer to that question is LF null, even though pick any day, how many days have elapsed to that point? The answer is some finite number. If it's day n, then n days have elapsed. Going backwards, the same thing is true, right? If you ask how many days have elapsed, what's the cardinality of the infinite past? The answer is LF null. But if you pick any day, going back however far you like, and you ask how distant is it from the present, the answer is some finite number, right? There isn't any day that's infinitely distant from the present day. Every day is only finitely many days earlier than today if there's an infinite past, right? And once you're clear about that distinction, you won't, when you're talking about either the infinite past or the infinite future, say infinite that there's some point in the past between which and now there's infinitely many days, or there's some point in the future by which there will be, it's infinitely many days from the present. Those things are just false, right? And that's quite important for resolving various puzzles that people, or sort of difficulties of reasoning that people have fallen into when thinking about the past and the present in connection to infinity.
That does seem, that does seem to lead to some quite big implications on these discussions. But perhaps drawing back to these paradoxes that you raised, the Hilbert's Hotel and the Grim Reaper's paradox, what would you say are some of the responses to such objections? Because I suppose a lot of theists might say that that's quite a strong reason for why the universe has a beginning. But some people might say, well, those aren't really applicable to I suppose, the real world, or these paradoxes are not actually very good arguments in favor of the Kalam cosmological argument, or the finitude of the past. What are perhaps some ways in which people could respond to these paradoxes?
So there's a bunch of things here. You might think that the past is finite, right? There might be good reasons for thinking that the past has to be finite. They have nothing to do with infinities, but just have to do with evidence that we've got that everything began with a bang a certain amount of time ago. And if you thought that was the only way that a world could begin, then you'd kind of get round to the view that the past has to be finite. It couldn't be infinite. So that would be a possibility. With the future, just thinking about the future, it's less clear, but it seems kind of plausible that the future is infinite, right? And it's possible maybe that the world will stop, the universe will stop expanding and collapse back in on itself, and then we end up with a finite future. But I gather that the kind of physical evidence isn't in favor of that. The physical evidence suggests that the future is infinite. Right? Okay, so there's one thing. What's possible if we suppose that the future's infinite? Could we build an infinite hotel? Right? Well, not given the laws of physics the way they are. Right? There's not enough materials, and in any case, if we sort of build a room a year, this is a project that would never finish. But in fact, not too far into the future, 10 to the 40 years or something like that, protons will have decayed. There will be no hotels, right? We don't have to worry about this as a real possibility. If there's going to be an infinite bunch of things in the universe, it'll be because there always have been infinitely many protons or quarks or maybe stars, right? And that's a kind of open question. We have a kind of lower bound on how big the universe is spatially, but we don't yet have an upper bound. So it's a kind of open question. I think it will probably turn out the universe is finite, but that's not something that's going to be settled by philosophical argument, right? That will be, if we can settle it, it'll be by finding some physical evidence. The past might be infinite, but if it is, it will be because there's a multiverse, and the multiverse is kind of infinite. The history of our universe begins when there was the bang, right? And there could be stuff back before that, but that's not going to open the possibility to kind of infinite sequences of things like Grim Reapers or anything like that, because the history has to go through that bottleneck where there's the Big Bang and inflation and all that stuff, and no familiar things exist there, right? So the question about whether the past is infinite, they're kind of trying to make up these scenarios that you can fit into an infinite history that involve people wrapping presents or whatever, are just completely irrelevant, right? Because that's not the history of our universe, right? That's what I think.
Yes. Do you think there are limits? And I suppose you talk about, a scientific evidence that we have to be familiar to. Do you think there's certain limits that philosophers of mathematics or philosophers of religion can actually say in relationship to the applicability of actual infinites to the real world? Do you think there's we can have all these discussions about paradox and whatnot, but it's kind of like within the limits of the scientific data that we're faced with? Is there any ways that, I suppose, philosophers of religion or I suppose mathematics can go beyond those limits to actually create a stronger proof of the potential or actual, well, the realization of an actual infinity in the world?
So I think things sort of go the other way. There's lots of sciences where we make models in which certain values are just taken to be unbounded, right? And these models have application to the real world. They make accurate predictions, right? Speculating about infinite hotels or infinite libraries or things like that is pure imaginative speculation. That's got no application to anything real worldly, according to me. But you would find it very difficult to do science if you cut yourself off from being able to use real analysis, for example. Right. So I think that the kind of justificatory question, approaching it from two different ways, there's lots of reasons to think that it's fine for the sciences to be deeply invested in the infinite, there's not much reason at all to think that philosophical speculation about the infinite is telling us anything interesting about the world in which we live. Right.
So from that categorization, would it be fair to say that someone perhaps could potentially accept William Lane Craig or these people or Andrew Lowe's arguments like Hilbert's Hotel and whatnot from a conceptual side, but still say that, well, the physical world is actually infinite, assuming that maybe we don't have cosmic background radiation or all these things? Someone could say, all right, we have this world, and the other side, the conceptual stuff, is on another debate.
So that's right. I mean, I think that it's kind of obvious that there can't be. I mean, I'm going to assume we hold fixed the laws and boundary conditions. It's obvious that there isn't and couldn't be in any world like ours an infinite hotel, right? For kind of boring, all sorts of boring reasons, right? But that tells you nothing about whether the past might be infinite. It's completely irrelevant, right? That's that's my view.
So perhaps developing into maybe the applications of the infinity to different areas of philosophy, especially the philosophy of religion, do you think that's one of, and I suppose developing on what we've just been discussing, is there almost this danger in these debates surrounding the Kalam cosmological argument, just because that's perhaps the first one which comes to mind, of people making an argument from or an irrelevant argument, for example, these like Grim Reaper paradoxes and Hilbert's Hotel? Do you think that's something which perhaps has distracted the kind of the conversation surrounding the Kalam away from this real world practical, I suppose, reality in relationship to the ways philosophers of religion or theists are trying to defend the existence of God?
So I don't think so. And I don't think that Craig was wrong to think about Hilbert's Hotel in the context of the kind of a priori arguments about whether the past is finite or not. And I think there's plenty of room to disagree with what he says. Similarly, I don't think that Kuhn's is, that it's kind of just totally weird that Kuhn's has tried to use the Grim Reaper paradox as an argument for causal finitism. On the other hand, I think that the very least you would want to say is these arguments are enormously controversial. I mean, I would want to say something stronger than that, but I have a particular, order, right? So.
Yes, no, that's quite interesting. Now, perhaps another implication that someone might have or view in relationship to, I guess, the conception of infinities would come to the properties of God. Someone says God's all powerful and God's like all knowing and whatnot. Is there, I suppose, some similar objection if someone says, okay, these ideas of infinity are somewhat contradictory or whatnot? How would someone, I suppose, wrestle with the ideas of an omniproperty of God and either the possibility or impossibility of infinity? And are those two, I suppose, when someone says God's infinitely powerful, what do they actually mean by saying God's infinitely powerful?
So I think this is a really good question. I think it's easier to think about in the context of omniscience, right? So consider the following identities. 1 is 1, 2 is 2, 3 is 3, 4 is 4, 5 is 5, and so on. How many identities of that form does God know? Right. And I think the only answer that you can give to that is Cantor's answer, right? Aleph null, right? Because if God only knows some finite number, we'll call it n. What's happened with n plus 1, right? God's supposed to be omniscient, right? So now this is not committing me to saying that God's knowledge is propositional, but but it will be perfectly correct to say that God knows all of these distinct things, because that 1 is 1 is a different thing from 2's being 2, and that's a different thing from 3's being 3. If God's omniscient, somehow God has to know all those things. And so I'm not worrying about how God knows it. I'm worrying about how, when we describe it, what does God know, right? And it looks like we're committed to an actual infinity there. So there's a perfectly good sense in which God's knowledge better be actually infinite.
And we use, I suppose, Aleph null to describe it. But I suppose we've talked about Aleph 1 and Aleph 2 or further orders of different Aleph numbers, would that perhaps, I suppose, impact God's knowledge of propositions? Or even if we throw God out of the picture for a moment, would one potentially say there are potentially a Aleph 1 or Aleph 2, I suppose, amount of propositions for God to know? Or is the amount of propositions purely kind of limited to Aleph null? If that kind of makes sense.
So Cantor thought that it was a consequence of his view that God's knowledge wouldn't be properly characterized by any of the Alephs. There had to be something that was so vast that no Aleph could number it. And that was the thing that was the only way that you could quantify God's knowledge, was to say that it was beyond all the Alephs. So that was Cantor's theology. So I think you're right. We're not going to say that God only knows Aleph null propositions or only knows Aleph 1 propositions. They pick any Aleph you like. God knows more than that many propositions would be the right way to think about it.
Would there be any other areas, perhaps apart from the philosophy of, inside the philosophy of religion, where infinities would, I suppose, pop up and people should, I suppose, be aware of it? Or I guess when people are approaching the philosophy of religion or just conceptions about God in general, where else do you think discussions about infinity can potentially, I suppose, be applicable?
So the most obvious place is Pascal's wager. So the idea that Pascal had was that there's an actually infinite reward that you get if you go to heaven. And he thought that in order to go to heaven, the kind of requirement you had to pass was you had to believe in God, whatever exactly that means. So now, if you're an atheist, you may think that this story is very unlikely, but we can do a calculation about the expected utility of believing and not believing in God. So you think if there's two outcomes, either you believe or you don't. There's two ways the world. There's two actions that you can perform. Either you believe or you don't. There's two ways the world can be. Either God exists or God doesn't exist. If God exists and you believe, you get the infinite reward. Otherwise, you don't. And there's some probability you give to God's existing, which Pascal just assumes isn't zero and isn't infinitesimal. So just call it P. Then you calculate the expected utility of believing. It'll be P times infinity plus some other fraction times some finite amount. And the expected utility of not believing will just be two fractions times two finite amounts. P times infinity is infinity, so the expected value of believing is infinite. The expected value of not believing is finite. In order to maximize expected utility, you should believe, right? That's Pascal's wager. And infinity is crucial to the argument. If the value of believing in God is merely some big finite quantity, then so long as your probability is small enough, you'll do the calculation and end up deciding that the expected utility favors disbelief. Right? So it's not just that infinity crops up in Pascal's wager; it's essential that it does. Right? So that would be the most obvious place.
So. From, I suppose, the philosophy of religion, we've talked a bit about the philosophy of religion and its relationship to infinity. Where else in philosophy does infinity, I suppose, come up the most? I assume it's quite a kind of a broad, it has implications in a lot of things, but what aspects of philosophy do you think in the discussion surrounding infinity is most applicable?
So I guess extending from Pascal's wager and just thinking about decision theory generally, there's a question about infinite sources of utility and what you should do in their presence. You don't have to think that God's the source of infinite utility. You could think that it was something else. And then there are these calculations that you can do when calculations of expected utilities in connection with various things that give you really strange outcomes. And they do because somewhere in the background there's an infinity lurking. So a classic example would be the St. Petersburg game, right? I'm going to toss a coin. If it comes up heads, I'll pay you $1. Toss a coin again. If it comes up heads, I'll pay you $2. Toss a coin again. If it comes up heads, I'll pay you $4. Toss a coin again. If it comes up heads, I'll pay you $8. Right? I'm going to go on doing this until I don't get ahead. At any point, you can take your winnings if you want. Right? What should you be prepared to pay in order to play this game? Well, there's a half a chance you'll win $1, plus there's a quarter of a chance that you'll win $2, plus there's an eighth of a chance that you'll win $8, plus there's a 16th of a chance that you'll win $16, and so on. Your expected utility for playing is infinite. So you should be prepared to play any amount of money, right? Right. You should actually be prepared to pay an infinite amount, but you should definitely be prepared to pay any finite amount in order to play this game with me just once. Right. Now that's insane, right? That's an insane outcome, right? What's the problem? Right. Well, one way of thinking about it is that if I'm offering you this game in good faith, I better have an infinite bank behind me, because there's some chance that I may have to pay out. Well, there's some chance I might have to pay out an infinite amount, right? And of course, I don't, right? You know, I don't have an infinite bank, right? And so I shouldn't be. I really am not in a position to play this game with you, even though, of course, if someone offered me a chance to play this game, I'm not going to. I'm at those odds, I'm not going to take them up on it, right?
Yes, definitely. So, I suppose perhaps to end off this interview, what would you say are some ways for viewers to either get a better understanding of the infinite if they haven't come to, I suppose, read about the infinite before? What would you say are some introductory books that someone could interact with, or what are some further works and further areas of philosophy that people can read into, I suppose, if they've already started reading about maybe the Kalam cosmological argument? That's because I'm just assuming that's probably where most of the viewers are coming from. Where next do you think they should turn to in order to get a better understanding of such debates?
So that's an interesting question. There are a bunch of kind of introductory books about infinity that are not bad. There are some written by physicists. There are some written by people who are philosophers. If you, for example, if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on infinity, of which I'm one of the co-authors, you might find that it's just too hard to get into, right? And so you might want to start with something like John Barrow's Infinity book, or there's a bunch of others, I can't remember them off the top of my head, that take you there more gently. And what in the end you need to do is to find maybe a good introductory text on set theory and other parts of mathematics, real analysis and things like that, because the real way to understand this stuff is to understand the mathematics that lies behind it, right? So and I can't recommend the texts that I learned this stuff from, because they don't exist anymore, right? The lecturers at Melbourne University just made up their own notes and distributed them. So I'm really not sure what to recommend if you want to do it seriously, but that's what I would recommend. I mean, maybe that's partly just because, as it happens, that's how my education went. I learned about the real analysis and cardinality and bijection and all that stuff before I came to philosophy.
So to end off this interview, where do you think debates in the discussion surrounding the infinity are going? What type of areas are they reaching, and where is the literature going currently?
Okay, so that's hard to answer too. So there's quite a literature on the Grim Reaper and causal finitism at the moment. But there's this question that you can ask about philosophy literature always and everywhere. Where's it going? Because philosophy tends to go around in very big circles. So there are topics that get intensively discussed for a while, and then kind of the discussion runs out of steam and it sort of sits for a while, and then people pick it up and it goes again for a while, and then it runs out of steam. And when they pick it up, they rediscover the stuff that was said the first time. They might advance in various ways, or it might be kind of a modulated discussion because there's other stuff that people at this second stage accept that kind of bears on the topic. And then it just goes like that. So it's not clear really that any philosophy is going anywhere. Right, except these kind of short-term trends, like the one I already mentioned. At the moment, there's a bunch of stuff being written about causal finitism and Benedetti's Grim Reaper paradox, and I don't see that running out of steam just yet. And then there's stuff being written about Pascal's wager. There's stuff being written about Hilbert's hotel-like problems and so on. It may well happen that in 20 years, people aren't talking about those topics because people feel like there's, amongst the people in the discussion, there's nothing new to say. But that doesn't mean they won't come back in 100 years' time, or it also doesn't mean that they won't continue to circulate in other circles, right? Like people, in schools or in seminaries or whatever will continue to discuss them. But I don't know. That's a really Weasley way of answering the question, isn't it? Right.
Yes, but I suppose the direction, as you say, of all philosophy kind of just goes around in circles, and it's quite difficult to kind of predict where they're going. But thank you very much for coming on to the channel. I really appreciated having this discussion with you. It's been so long since I've read about the infinity, and I'm sure the viewers of the channel would really appreciate listening to your introduction, your discussion on the topic. Thank you very much for coming on. And if you do want to check out Dr. Graham Oppy's book on the infinity, I'll put a link to that book down in the comments below. And of course, I'll try to find links to the book that he recommended on the introduction to the infinity as well, and I'll put that in the description below just for your aid. So thank you for watching, stay safe, and I'll see you soon in the next video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.